Do you want to get rich in Warframe with tons of Arcanes, resources, Steel Essence, and Platinum? Well, then Void Cascade is by far the most profitable game mode to do so. That's why in this video, I will give you a full, updated 2026 Void Cascade guide and tell you everything that you need to know. How to play it, the best weapons, operator, amps, basically your one-stop shop. Big shout out to all the generous channel members who helped me keep the lights on, and now let's jump right into it. But okay, this is probably going to be a long video, so first of all, let's very quickly go over the basics again, just so that we're all on the same page. Void Cascade is a very popular game mode to get a ton of valuable loot very fast. This will be the focus of today's video. To unlock Void Cascade, you have to have the Zariman 10-0 unlocked, and that means you have to finish the Angels of the Zariman story quest. After that, you will have the Void Cascade mission node available on your star map, and you could already play it at level 50 to 55. However, this video in specific is going to focus on only Steel Path Void Cascade, because that is where you really buff up your loot potential. How about we quickly go over how one of these Void Cascade runs works. First things first, just like with other Zariman missions, the enemy faction that you're going to be facing changes over time. You have a rotation between Grineer as well as Corpus enemies. The game mode itself then works as follows. In Void Cascade, you have to clear these type of pillars called Exilizers. Every Exilizer at the beginning has a bubble around it in which you can only enter as your operator or drifter. Your Warframe will stay out. In this bubble now, you will see a couple of void rifts that are connected to the Exilizer in the center. In order to cleanse the Exilizer, you first need to delete these void rifts. To do that, either hit them with your operator amp, void sling through them, or, depending on your focus school, some operator abilities also work. Once all the rifts are gone, you will see this void manifestation, this ghost appearing over the Exilizer, which you then also need to delete with your operator by hitting it with your amp. After clearing this ghost, the Exilizer then is gonna spawn a Thrax unit. You now switch back into your Warframe and take out the physical form of the Thrax unit, at which point the Thrax will enter into its ghost state. In this state, you cannot hurt it with your normal Warframe weaponry, but instead you need to go back into your operator and take out this ghost form with your operator amp again. Once that is done, you have officially cleansed the Exilizer. In your mission UI right here, you see an overview of how many cleansed as well as how many possessed Exilizers you have, plus a meter that shows how severe the void corruption is. If you have more cleansed Exilizers than possessed ones, the meter is automatically going to move down over time, which is good. If the number of cleansed and possessed Exilizers is the same, then the meter is not going to move automatically at all. And naturally, if there are more possessed Exilizers than cleansed ones, the meter is going to go up, which is bad. Now, one more mechanic that I should mention here is that if you take out normal enemies in the vicinity of a cleansed Exilizer, then you can see that their sort of souls or whatever are being sucked up by the Exilizer. This is another strategy that you can use to quickly reduce the corruption meter back down if it's starting to get out of hand. And yeah, that's basically how the mission works. The game is going to spawn more and more Exilizers in, and you gotta try to cleanse them as well as make sure that Thrax units don't retake the already cleansed Exilizers. After you've successfully cleansed 4 Exilizers and defended them until their timer runs out, you will complete one round, aka one of the reward rotations. Of course, this is an infinite game mode, so you can stay in as long as you like. And that is exactly the key point with Void Cascade. See, you might have been asking yourself, why is this game mode in particular so very much profitable? Let me tell you. The key thing about Void Cascade are these Thrax enemies that come out of the possessed Exilizers and will spawn in even more to retake the already cleansed ones. If we take a look at the drop table in the Warframe wiki, and we can see that Thrax units have a chance of dropping a bunch of different Arcanes. That is exactly what we're after. And one very beneficial thing in Void Cascade is that the longer you stay in and the higher the enemy level goes over time, the more of these Thrax units are going to be spawned in. That is why so many people play level cap Void Cascade, because you're going to have so many Thrax units spawning that you're going to drown in all of these juicy Arcane drops. Add to that the fact that in Steel Path, you have a higher mod drop chance than in normal mode anyway, and Arcanes are affected by mod drop chance. And additionally, maybe throw in the occasional mod drop chance booster, and you can very quickly see where that goes. All these Arcanes can then either be sold to other people for Platinum, or be turned into Phosphor to convert into other Arcanes that you might need or that you want to sell. However, that is not all. Due to the fact that we're playing in Steel Path, you're also constantly going to be visited by Acolytes. And as we all know, Acolytes drop Arcanes too that you can turn into Phosphor or sell, plus they give you Steel Essence, which is another valuable resource. On top of that, you're also going to get Thrax Plasm as a resource drop from the Thrax unit, as well as Void Gel Orbs as an uncommon drop from enemies as well. These resources can be used to fuel your helmet, for example, and if you combine all of this together, then you know why Void Cascade, and especially high-level endurance Void Cascade, is so freaking good. And in the rest of the video now, I'm gonna explain to you everything you need to know to do this really good. Before that though, if you could leave a quick like, then that would be really helpful with the YouTube algorithm, so thank you so much for your support. But okay. Now we're all back up to speed on the basics of Void Cascade. So, in this next chapter, we're not going to talk about the tactics of how to play Void Cascade efficiently. As a quick disclaimer though, I should say I'm going to jump into a lot of different tactics, and some of them are very try-hard, very sweaty, very efficient, right? What I'm trying to say is, you do not have to follow every little minuscule step that I mention here to have a somewhat decent Void Cascade experience. Also, I want to give a couple of quick shoutouts because I used quite some information sources from the community to put all of this together. This will be, for once, Tenokal's Void Cascade video, that was very helpful, as well as the very long and detailed video from Hungpain from like half a year ago. I also consulted the written Void Cascade guide by J.C. Gziosen, let's just pretend I pronounced that right, and also I had help from Bardini, whom I asked a couple of questions in Discord. I'm going to put links to all these sources in the description down below. But now, let's finally talk tactics. Let's talk playing Void Cascade efficiently. And the first topic when it comes to strategy is map generation. Now, I know this might sound incredibly boring and you might want to skip ahead, but please do not do that, because for Void Cascade, it is actually very important to understand how the tile sets work in order to avoid the common mistakes which lead to you having to bounce between 50 gajillion exilizers that are 3 kilometers apart. So please, bear with me for a minute. First of all, when you start a Void Cascade mission, the tile set for the mission is always going to generate in the same scheme. You're going to have 3 main rooms in which the exilizers will spawn, and all the other rooms are just connectors, walkways, or dead ends that don't matter for the actual gameplay. These main rooms then are also always going to spawn in one main line. There won't be any cross connections or whatever. It is always going to be the elevator connected to room A connected to room B, and room B connected to room C. No exceptions. These 3 main rooms then that are going to spawn in will draw from a pool of 12 possible rooms in total. So basically there are 12 rooms as part of the Zeraman tile set which can serve as any of these 3 main rooms. And the reason why it is so important to know these rooms is because of the exilizer spawns. Remember what we said in the basics? You gotta cleanse 4 exilizers for every single reward rotation. Thing though is that depending on which rooms spawn in as part of the tile set, a different number of exilizers is going to spawn in any room. To be more precise, there are 7 rooms that can only spawn 3 exilizers, 4 rooms that can spawn 4 exilizers, and only 1 room that has 5 potential spawning points for exilizers. I'm now going to show you all of these rooms and also how many exilizers go in every room. And yes, I know this might sound very unimportant and theoretical, but trust me, it is going to become incredibly important in the next step, so please don't skip over this. We have this room right here, which we call Agri Zone, and it can have 3 potential exilizer spawns. The Amphitheater can have 3 ones too. There's a room called Brig, looks pretty similar to the Agri Zone, and also has 3 exilizer spawns. The Cargo Bay, even though pretty big and recognizable, only has 3 spawns too, as well as the Habitation Zone with the big statue and the Hall of Legems with the big staircase. The Lunaro Sports Court is also very recognizable, but also here only 3 Exilizer spawn points. The bigger rooms, which can contain 4 Exilizers, would be the Albrecht Park right here with the big statue in the middle, the Angel Roost, which has a pretty similar map but looks very much differently, the Schoolyard, which looks like this, and there's a 4th one which is called Serenity Levels, but to be perfectly honest, after 1 hour of trying to generate this, it just never appeared. Let me just say it looks like the Albrecht Park, just without the statue and more trees. And then finally, the big 1 room, which can have up to 5 Exilizers, that would be the hangar right here. You can easily identify it by all the parked landing craft. By the way, all of these names and maps, those are from the written Void Cascade guide of JC Gzios, so thank you so much for putting all that together. But okay, what does all of this now mean? Let's quickly recap. We know now that our Void Cascade map is always going to have 3 rooms in one line, and those 3 rooms are going to be some variation of the 12 ones that we just talked about. In each room then, there can either be 3, 4 or 5 potential Exilizer spawns, determined by which rooms the game generated. Now, why does all of this matter? Remember how we previously said you need to cleanse 4 Exilizers to finish 1 reward rotation? Well, as a player, you can't influence how quickly these Exilizers spawn in. They are completely on their own timer. However, one thing that very strongly determines your clear time is how long you take to cleanse them. And actually, if you have to walk between the rooms all the time, it will overall take much longer to finish one of these reward rotations with 4 Exilizers. That is why, in an ideal case scenario, you want to play on a map with as many big rooms as you can get your hands on. That is why many players who want to play very efficiently and very much try hard this game mode, they jump into the mission multiple times, take a quick look at the tile set, and then they restart the mission until they got a good spawn. I'm not saying that you have to do that, right? This is one of the points that is perfectly viable to also just not pay attention to. Just saying that if you really want to go full efficiency, you're looking for a pretty big room generation and rather not the small ones. So much for the whole map generation information. You might think that was a bit unnecessary, but we're gonna get back to the room generation and how many Exilizer spawns per room happen a bit later when we talk about the ideal tactics on how to play. So keep it in mind for now. However, now though, let's talk a bit more about the actual game tactics and what you have to look out for most when playing Void Cascade. Given the fact that the game mode becomes more and more profitable the longer you stay in it and the higher the enemy level goes, that means ideally you're trying to stay in here for long. And that is exactly why staying alive and just not going down is the biggest and most important thing that you need to look out for. So let's talk about how to best do that. The first step here would be, of course, right, to pick the right Warframe. In theory, of course, every Warframe goes, right? But naturally, the more tanky ones or the ones that are very survivable do work best. This can either be a Warframe that gets survivability from their abilities, like Revenant with his Mesmer skin. It could be a Warframe who has really good overguard regeneration, like Kullervo with his Augment or maybe Dante. Invisible Warframes are also absolutely golden for Void Cascade, because when enemy can't see you, enemy can't hurt you. And finally, now in 2026, even health tanks like an Aros or a Nidus have become absolute gems for this game mode due to the introduction of Arcane Persistence. For all the other frames then, who don't have specific survivability tools, those will unfortunately have to rely on normal shield gating, because if you really stay long, then the enemy levels will go so high that even the tankiest frame would get one hit otherwise. That is why preparing for high-level survivability is important for Void Cascade. By the way, when it comes to the Warframes, I'm going to give you some example builds later in the video. We're going to talk about that. Just for the time being, I want to give you some additional tips on what can help you to stay alive even more. For example, you could equip your companion with the Guardian mod. This one is especially helpful for shield gating because it kind of does the shield gating for you. Also, another great thing is Rolling Guard. 3 seconds of invulnerability, especially at level cap, very, very valuable. Being knocked down though can be very deadly at level cap, which is why many players like to use Prime Sure-Footed in level cap Void Cascade. If however, you don't like Prime Sure-Footed or you simply don't have it available yet, then don't worry, alternatively you can use Worm as your companion and equip him with the Negate mod. This basically does the same thing as Prime Sure-Footed. Just one very important thing that I need to mention here, and this is a common mistake that I see time and time again. Keep in mind that certain duration-based or channeled abilities, when they're active on your Warframe, they will make that your Warframe remains vulnerable while you are in operator mode. Don't think that your Warframe is always going to be invincible when in operator. That's not the case. The best way to check which of these abilities leaves your frame vulnerable and which doesn't would be to simply go into the simulacrum, activate the ability, and then transition into operator. If the health bar over your Warframe is great, that means they're invincible, but if it is colored, that means they can go down while you're an operator. Very relevant at level cap, because it happens so often that you go into operator to cleanse the Equalizer, and once you transition back in, you're just instantly dead. So, in order to prevent that from happening, what you can do is either activate Rolling Guard before you go into your operator, that will give you 3 seconds of leeway, or you bring, for example, Shade or the Huras Kubro as your companion, who will cloak your Warframe while you are in operator. However, no matter how well you prepare, if you go for a long endurance mission, you will most likely still go down a couple of times. But luckily, also here there is one thing that you can do to prevent death, and that would be to unlock the last Gasp Waybound from the Unairu Focus School. With this, you can bring your Warframe back from the bleed out state if you take out enemies with your operator. One great tip here would be to aim for spectral forms of nearby Thrax units, because those go down very quickly from operator fire. Or alternatively, you can also go and unlock the other Unairu Waybound too. This way you get enough amp damage to usually be able to easily take out the normal enemies as well. So yeah, now we've talked about how you can prevent death, which is arguably the most important part about Void Cascade. However, just surviving is not the only thing. You also have to be able to attack these Equalizers quickly, cleanse them, and prevent them from being retaken. So, let's talk about how to do that most efficiently. First of all, for attacking Equalizers, the best focus school for your operator would be Madarai. With Madarai, you can use the operator skill Containment Wave to hit multiple of these Void Rifts at the same time. This can be very helpful when they're bunched up. Once that's done, the Thrax Enemies spawns. And when it comes to Thraxes, then we have a lot to talk about. Let's get into how to take out Thrax enemies most efficiently. First of all, in Void Cascade there are two types of Thrax enemies, the Thrax Legatus and the Thrax Centurion. Both of these Thrax enemy types have different moves and different attacks, but to be honest, I don't want to get too deep into that right here, because ideally, you just want to snipe them into oblivion before they can even do any of that. So here's how to do that. One thing that is very important to keep in mind is that Thrax enemies have Overguard, and a whole lot of that. In fact, if we go to the Warframe wiki page for those Thrax units, and we look at their HP scaling as the level increases, you will see that the scaling of the Overguard points is much faster than the scaling of the actual HP. So your main focus with high-level Thrax units is to take out the Overguard much more than it is the actual health. This is why the most common tactic against Thrax units is to actually take a strong secondary weapon against them, because secondaries have access to the Arcane Secondary Fortifier. This one will not only give you personally Overguard for dealing damage to enemy Overguard, but the main thing is that it gives you an 8 times damage boost against enemy Overguard. That is really big. Don't worry, also here we're going to talk about meta weapons and example builds later in the video. One more thing though that is important against this enemy Overguard would be to prime them with magnetic status effects. Remember, magnetic status effects are basically the same thing as viral, just against shields and Overguard. So priming Thraxes with magnetic makes it even easier to melt away their Overguard. Oh yeah, and of course, Thrax units are armored too, so naturally after you've gotten rid of the Overguard, you're looking into some form of armor stripping as well. But I think that's pretty much a no-brainer, right? But okay. Let's say you did all of that very well, you shot down the health bar of the Thrax unit, what then? Once you've taken out the physical form of a Thrax unit, that is when they're going to go into their ghost form, and this ghost form can only be damaged by your operator amp. This is unfortunately where most players waste the majority of their damage potential. So let's go over how to do it properly. Ideally, what you want to do is you want to try to one-shot this ghost form. This, however, can only reliably done if you manage to headshot it. Luckily though, that is actually much easier than it seems. when we take a look at it in slow-mo, then what we will see is when the ghost form exits the physical body of the Thrax, then it will always go into a predetermined 360 animation. And at the end of that animation, the ghost form will always look into the exact same direction that the physical form was looking the moment you took it out. So what you as player want to do is, in this 1-second animation of the ghost leaving the body, you want to position yourself in a way that you can easily aim at the head and then just simply give him a one-tap. Might sound a bit difficult at first, but trust me, if you practice this like 5-10 minutes in the simulacrum, you will have zero problem pulling it off in the mission. Now, of course, not every amp will always be able to one-shot the Thrax units, which is why later in the video we're going to have a separate chapter for only all the operator shenanigans that you need to look out for to maximize your damage, and we're going to talk about that in more detail. Also, at the end of the video, after we talked about how to build your operator, we're quickly going to get back to the Thraxes again so that I can show you how to take them out efficiently while using all the advanced operator buffs. Unfortunately though, Thraxes are not the only dangerous enemies in Void Cascade. We also have to quickly talk about Acolytes. They can disable your abilities, they can give you self-damage and basically take you out in a split second. So, here's what you want to look out for. First of all, Acolytes are very weak to strong melee attacks like heavy slams or such. If you want to take them out very easily, you could for example bring a heavy slam melee and that will make quick work of them even at very high levels. Additionally, they're also very weak to multiplicative condition overload projectile weapons. I'm not going to go into what multiplicative condition overload is in this video, just saying that if you bring something like the Stalta and give it a lot of crit chance, that usually melts away Acolytes pretty quickly. Also, one surefire way to make yourself Acolyte-proof is to use Banshee's Silence as a helmet ability. It's not the most meta helmet for Void Cascade, I'm just saying if you find yourself struggling against those one-hit Acolytes, Banshee's Silence is amazing because it will make sure to silence the Acolyte before it can come and silence you. And finally, another tip would be to use the Magus Lockdown Arcane on your operator, because this one makes it that when you Void Sling near the Acolyte, it will hit the Acolyte with this tether grenade thing, which will also stun the Acolyte for hopefully long enough for you to be able to take care of them. But alright, you now know how to take care of the high priority targets in the mission. But staying alive and taking those out are still not the only things that you need to take care of. Another key aspect of Void Cascade is movement. See, as we previously said, you want to try to finish these exilizers as quickly as possible, and that naturally involves having to move from room A to room B to room C and back. If, however, you're too slow, then that can not only hurt the mission completion speed, but in the worst case, it can even mess up the whole Exilizer spawn rotation, which will make everything even messier later in the mission. So, you gotta make sure that your movement is optimal. Let's talk about how to do that. The first tip here that I can give is, of course, to get your muscle memory up to speed. Just play a bunch of Void Cascade and over time, you will learn the tileset and just automatically move better than somebody who never plays on the Zeraman at all. On top of that though, one stat that very much helps with your movement would be parkour velocity. So, how do you get more parkour velocity? Well, first of all, you could of course play a very agile Warframe. You don't necessarily have to look for one with a lot of sprint speed, but as an example, Titania is very good at traversing tilesets very quickly. I'm not saying that Titania is like Void Cascade meta or anything, but technically you can play any Warframe, and if you struggle with mobility, do whatever you like. To increase your very parkour velocity stat though, one thing you could do for example is to take the Praetos as your melee weapon of choice. This is a very tried and tested method because in its Incarnon form, it will give you buffs to your parkour velocity. Also, you could equip your Warframe with Arcane Consequence if your build has an Arcane slot that is not 100% necessary. You could also use mods like Ice Spring or Mobilize, because those two will give you more parkour velocity, and this is probably my favorite, you can always give them yellow Archon shards for that parkour velocity increase as well. Now that we've talked about all the important key points that you have to know about Void Cascade, let's finally talk about how an efficient Void Cascade run will look like in practice, both as a team as well as in solo Void Cascade. Let's though start with the team tactics, because if you go in with multiple players, the mode will be much quicker and more efficient than you can do it solo. Now, usually what you want to do is split the team up between dedicated attackers and defenders. So now, what does the attacker and defender role even mean? See, the job of the attackers in the team is to cleanse exilizers that are newly popping up as absolutely quickly as possible. They're supposed to ignore everything else, and their own job is, if the possessed exilizer is going to spawn in, they jump at it and try to purge it as quickly as possible. This also means that if the team is still occupied in one room and the next exilizer already spawns in the next room, then ideally the attacker should already be in that room when that happens to instantly attack it right away. That is exactly the point where we need to come back to the map generation and the rooms. Remember, previously we've talked about which rooms can generate and how many exilizer spawns per room take place? Well, that is precisely it. If you know how many exilizer spawns you have in your current room, then you know when the attacker has to start moving on to the next room already, right? If you start, let's say, in a room with 3 spawns and the third exilizer just spawned in, then after cleansing that, the attacker will already move into the next room because they know the next exilizer will spawn in that room. If they wait in the first room until they see the notification on the map, they lose valuable time if they move on only at that point. And then on the other side of the spectrum, the defenders are the polar opposite. The job of the defender is to protect the already cleansed exilizers from being retaken by new Thrax enemies. If this happens, that is very bad and it can ruin your entire exilizer rotation, which is why the defenders are dead set of staying in the room and making sure none of the already cleared exilizers will be retaken. Only then will the defenders actually move on. And just as a little tip on the side here, when the timer on the exilizer is below 1/8, something like this in the background here, at that point it is safe to move on, because then the exilizer doesn't have enough time to be repossessed anymore. One thing though that is very, very important to mention here is, please don't go out of your way to pick up Arcane or Steel Essence drops. Especially the Arcane drops will remain on the field for 20 minutes, so it is not advised to leave your actual role and go out of your way into the next room to pick up an Arcane or something. So much for how to play Void Cascade as a team. However though, what if you want to play solo Void Cascade? Well, that changes things quite a bit, so also here, let me tell you how to do it most efficiently. The first important thing here, something that you have to do before even starting the mission, is make sure that your game is set to solo, not invite only, not friends only, solo mode. This is because if you play in solo mode, you can actually press escape during the mission and pause the game. If you need to get up and go to the toilet, if it rings at the door, just press escape, it's all going to be fine. If, however, you set it to invite only or friends only or whatever, then it won't pause the game if you press escape. That can ruin your run, so please don't do that. The next thing that is important if you want to play for a long endurance solo cascade is to make sure to check out the tileset before you invest a lot of time into it. What I mean here is that for solo cascade in particular, it is important to have a tileset generation where you don't have crazy long walkways between room A, B, and C. So if you start playing and you get a pop-up that says the next exilizer spawns 850 meters away, that will be your signal to cancel the mission and try again. However though, when you're solo, there is one main difference to the team play, and that is that you now have to do the attacking and the defending at the same time. And this is where most solo players make the biggest mistake, which will then in the end lead to having to bounce between 3 rooms all the time. So, how do you do it right? To be fair, also here I've heard about multiple theories and also about exilizer rotation manipulation and stuff. However, I personally decided to leave these topics out in this guide because they're incredibly in-depth and there are also certain bugs which makes it a very finicky topic. So instead what I'm gonna explain here is the strategy that worked best for me. And that is to simply stay in the room that you're currently in and only move on once it is completely safe. Let me make an example. Let's say your starting room has 3 exilizer spawns. You go in, the first exilizer spawns, you cleanse it, the second exilizer spawns, you cleanse it, the third exilizer spawns, you cleanse it, and then the next Exilizer appears in room B. What are you gonna do now? Well, what you're definitely not gonna do is already move on to room B. If you do that, then I can almost guarantee you some Thraxes are gonna spawn back in room A, they're gonna attack the Exilizer, and you will not be able to get back to room A to defend in time. Instead, what you want to do is ignore everything that is spawning in room B for the time being and stay in room A and babysit your Exilizers until they're all finished. Or at least until the last Exilizer is down to 1/8 of its timer and it is safe to move on. This, of course, will lead to a situation where you're still defending the last Exilizer in room A, while there might already be 2 or 3 new possessed Exilizers in room B. This can be scary because it will increase the Void Corruption meter, but as long as you're staying within the radius of that one Exilizer and you're taking out enemies to reduce the Corruption meter again, you have nothing to worry about. But what are your solo tactics? Let us know in the comments down below. Whew, that was a whole bunch of theory and how to play the mission. But I hope you now know how exactly to behave in which situation and master the game mode. So, how about now we get to the chapter that most of you have been waiting for, I assume, and that would be how to put together your perfect Void Cascade loadout. Now, before we get into the weapon and Warframe and everything options, let me just say one thing. I will mention a bunch of weapons, Warframes, and so on that I personally think are really good in Void Cascade. However, that does not mean that if I don't mention a certain thing, that thing is bad, okay? And if you want to mix and match a couple of different mods with different Archon shards with a different loadout, that is perfectly fine. My builds here are just a suggestion as a base to start your own personal Void Cascade setup. Frame number 1 is, of course, the convenience king of Void Cascade himself, Revenant. We all know him, most people don't like him because he's not all that interesting to play, but anyway, that all does not matter because Revenant makes Void Cascade incredibly easy and comfy. The build that you see right here is what I personally use to play Void Cascade. I use Roar as a subsume for more damage, and I use Arcane Energize to be completely independent with my energy economy from any Equilibrium companion or all whatnot. Second Arcane is flexible depending on what type of weapon or setup you're playing, and overall, not much to say here, right? It's Revenant, you give him a lot of strength, you use Mesmer Skin, you have a bunch of charges, and you just don't die and you have decent damage output. That's really all there is to it. Number 2, and this is a very, very strong contender because of a little bug that has been existing forever. Of course, we're talking about Gauss. See, the reason why I think Gauss is so strong in particular is that he has this certain interaction with Arcane Aegis. What I'm talking about is, if you have a red line on and your battery is full, then for some reason you get infinite constant shield recharge through Arcane Aegis. Even if Arcane Aegis runs out, it's a little bit finicky, it's most definitely not intended, but it has been in the game forever, so I might as well just use it on this build. This right here is what we're talking about, and apart from Arcane Aegis, which enables this synergy, everything else here is relatively straightforward. In this example here, I did not use a Helminth ability. However, in my personal opinion, if you wanted to use one, you would put it over his 2. Why over the 2? Because if you have the 2 on, then you lose battery charge when you get hit. And this invincibility shield recharge thing that I just talked about, that only works if the battery is actually full. I then also used Thermal Transfer to give my weapons a massive damage bonus through Thermal Sunder, and that then all in all leads us to this very strong Gauss build which cannot die thanks to the little bug that still exists. Up next, Inaros. I don't think I need to explain all too much, right? Inaros used to be one of the worst level cap frames because he, had health and he couldn't shield gate, but now that we have the magical Arcane Persistence right here, big health tanks like Inaros are basically level cap gold. For the build right here, what we focus on is giving him a lot of health, so far nothing new, but also I gave him a lot of ability strength so that if you use a Helminth subsume, ideally in this case Roar actually, then you would have a bunch of bonus damage for your weapon. What does matter though is for this build in particular, you want to have 3 Tau Forged blue shards all into more armor. This will lead to Inaros having over 1400 armor, meaning even if he takes a heat proc, he will still have enough armor to keep arcane persistence up. That is very important. Another honorable mention that I don't want to miss out on in this video would be Seren, one of the strongest weapon damage buffers in the game. The question though is, what makes Seren so good in Void Cascade now? Well, this all comes down to one specific build that also got enabled by Arcane Persistence. Let me explain. What we do here is we have to infuse Gloom from Sevagoth. What this does is not only slowing down the enemies around you, but it also heals you whenever the spores that you spread with your one deal their damage ticks to enemies. This way, it will give you so much heal that you easily out-heal the 500 damage per second that you're going to be taking at level cap through Arcane Persistence. Just go and add to that some more health that you have a little bit of leeway with Arcane Blessing and around about 1000 health at base, and you have a somewhat invincible Seren who will have no issues competing in Void Cascade whatsoever. Also here though, I should say, ideally you would want to do the same thing with Inaros with the shards here, give her a lot of armor so that also she gets to over 1400. How about though, we talk a little bit about invisible frames. You know, health tanking and being Revenant is not the only thing that can keep you alive. If you're invisible, enemy can't see you, enemy can't hurt you, so let's get into Ash. He's very good for Void Cascade too, and that comes down to mostly two features. On the one hand, he has Smokescreen. This makes him invisible, so you're pretty defensive. And then on the other hand, you have Shuriken. This one is equipped with the Seeking Shuriken augment, which strips away enemy armor. So you just throw that shuriken at the Thrax unit and their armor is going to be gone. Very nice to have a built-in armor stripping ability. For this build right here, I focus on having a lot of ability strength so that if I wanted to add a helmet ability over my 3, let's say, we would get more weapon damage out of Roar, out of Nourish, you get the point, and a lot of duration so that my invisibility is more comfy and doesn't need to be recharged all that often. This one slot up here would ideally feature Prime Sure-Footed, but I didn't have enough mod space to fit that on for this showcase, so just imagine this one here is also full Prime Sure-Footed, pretty important for an invisible build like this. Speaking of invisible frames though, let's talk about Wisp, because yes, Wisp is actually also one of the frames that I would consider invisible. Let's talk about it. First of all, with her passive, whenever she's in the air, she's considered invisible, enemies can't see her. Then, if you shoot out the clone from her too, as long as that's on the field, you're also invisible, plus every enemy is sort of hard-forced with their attention onto the well-shaped butt of your clone. The build then capitalizes on this invisibility as our means of defense and goes for a shield gating approach with Brief Respite in case we do still take that occasional hit. Also here, similar to the other Void Cascade builds, I go for Roar because, Roar is a great weapon damage boost, and I also use Arcane Precision to give weapon damage to our secondary weapon, which will be our Thrax killer of choice. Let's though also talk about Zephyr. She has a kit that is surprisingly almost tailor-made for Void Cascade. Let me explain why. First of all, as we mentioned 1,000 times already, survivability is like the most important thing. So, what we're going for is Turbulence. This one makes you completely untouchable by any type of lasers or projectiles, aka like 90% of the incoming damage. On top of that, your tornadoes make it very easy to clear large crowds, and you also have a grouping tool. However, one of the main culprits, so to speak, would be air burst rounds. Whenever you use your grouping ability, then you get more secondary weapon damage based on how many enemies you grouped. And given the fact that ideally we're using a secondary weapon to kill the Thraxes, that is of course a very strong buff. Like for example with this build, you get 100% damage for every enemy hit. That can be super duper strong. Just one thing I wanted to mention, ideally, right, instead of Intensify here, you would use Umbral Intensify, but also here the mod space wasn't really enough for fitting that in, so just imagine this here's Umbral Intensify. Okay? Okay. But okay, have a couple of solid Warframe and Warframe build suggestions to base your loadout on. Let's next though talk about another very important point, and that would be your 3 weapons of choice. First of all, one thing that I should mention about the weapons is that your choice of weapons strongly depends on if you play alone or in a team. If you're in a team, then you can have dedicated roles for people to only focus on Acolytes, to only focus on Thrax units, or to take out the small trash mobs. However, if you play alone, you need to unite all the roles in one loadout. So, let's take a look at a couple of options that are very popular in Void Cascade with corresponding build examples. Starting out, I want to do with a couple of secondary weapon options. As we previously said, secondaries are our ideal weapon to take out Thrax units because of that one arcane that is so magic against Overguard, and that would be Secondary Fortifier. This one is going to be a common occurrence on every secondary weapon on this list. So yeah, the first weapon that I want to talk about is the Furies Incarnon. First of all, the evolutions that I use personally here are the one that gives us more base damage, the one that increases our magazine capacity, and the one that gives us more status chance. The build then is what you just saw, where we focus on a lot of crit as well as status chance, and then we go a lot into magnetic. Why magnetic? Because magnetic is to Overguard what viral is to normal health. Very, very good to melt away the Overguard of a Thrax unit. I personally have a Riven here that gives me even more crit chance and electricity and damage, which is pretty beefy, but if you don't have that, you would just replace it with something else. You could give it more elemental damage, you could put another Hornet Strike in, do whatever you please. Another meta weapon for Void Cascade that everybody recommends is the Latum Incarnon, or the Latum in general because it's one of the original Incarnons. You get the point, right? The evolutions that I chose are the one with the fire rate, the one with more reload speed, the one with less critical chance for more status chance, and the one for plus 2000% damage. So far, nothing new. In the build here, nothing crazy, right? Secondary Fortifier again, and then we focus on a lot of damage overall, right? You don't need to carbon copy every single mod here. The important part is Secondary Fortifier, Galvanized Shot, and again we go into magnetic with a lot of status chance, so we melt away the Overguard. If, however, you wanted to have a weapon that can group clear a couple of trash mobs and deal potent damage against the Thrax units, then a nice hybrid weapon would be, for example, the Kuvanukor, with something like this right here in the background. Also here, magnetic, secondary fortifier, and galvanized shot. So far, nothing new. One thing I should mention about this build though is that we go for a lot of crit damage because it's the Kuvanukor, right? We get to 12.5x. But in order for this whole thing to work, you do need something like Arcane Avenger on your Warframe to give you the crit chance you need. Another crazy strong hybrid option here would be the Dual Toxicist Incarnon. Evolutions are as follows, those are the ones that I'm personally using, and this right here is the build. Again, pretty much the same thing, magnetic, galvanized shot, secondary fortifier, it's gonna melt through absolutely everything. However, if you don't want to use your secondary weapon as a damage dealer at all, and you rather go for a primary, you could go for something like the Grimoire as a support weapon. You can give it a strength buff, you can have an efficiency boost, right? It's the Grimoire, have a bunch of tome mods, pick whatever your personal loadout needs. Just quickly wanted to mention that. And just speaking of support weapons, if you really want to go for a primary to deal the damage against Thrax units, then your best weapon of choice would probably be the Compressor Prime. This is the best single target primary in the game, build it for something like this, and you're going to inflict so many status effects on those Thraxes that whatever you attack them with is going to be very, very strong. But yeah, let's now talk about the primary weapons. How about that? And the first thing I want to mention is the Pseudo Prime. Probably one of the most used primaries in Void Cascade, because this is effectively your status primer. This right here is the build that I personally use to prime. We go for a lot of status chance, status duration. I add a couple of combined elements, and overall, if you add to this that we're going to have the 4 base elements as well from the disc, it's going to be a pretty strong status primer. If you want to deal damage with your primary weapon, then we're going to look at something like the Burst on Prime Incarnon, right? Very, very, very strong weapon, and this right here would be somewhat of a build that would work. Again, we go for magnetic, we go for a lot of crit as well as a lot of status, and one of my personal favorites with the primaries here, you can go for primary Bulwark, right? Give your Warframe of choice a lot of armor, and then Primary Bulwark is going to give you conditionless high damage. It's really good because it doesn't need to be stacked up in any way, shape, or form. Of course, though, other primary weapons that are very strong in general also work. There's the Fenmore, there's like the Latron Prime Incarnon. You get the point. Generally, everything that is very strong is going to be very strong against Thrax units. And lastly, an honorable mention for a bit of a niche case, and that would be the Mitre or the Mitre Incarnon with the Mitre-specific augment mod that I don't even own. What I'm trying to say is that the Mitre has an augment mod that can pop nullifier bubbles instantly, and if the corpus are currently in the Void Cascade, that can be pretty helpful if you really don't have anything else that you need your primary slot for. Not gonna have an example build because I personally haven't even built the Mitre, I just wanted to mention that on the side. And then finally, of course, we also need to talk about the melee weapons, and here we kind of sort of have 2-3 different mentalities as to what we can go for. The first and probably the most popular choice would be to go for glaives. Doesn't have to be the Zora in specific, it can be the Sorata, especially when the corpus are there, it can be anything else, that's not really the point. The reason why we want to use glaives is because they are amazing AoE weapons to take out hordes of trash mobs very quickly. For the build right here, we of course go for electric melee influence, and due to the fact that most Warframe builds are probably going to use Roar as a subsume, I also didn't add a faction mod. If, however, you don't have Roar on your Warframe, then I would recommend maybe going for a faction mod, depending on whether it's currently the Grineer or the Corpus who are occupying the mission. Alternatively, one thing we can do is we can use a heavy slam melee. This is particularly against Acolytes if you don't have something like the Stolta in your primary slot. Acolytes are pretty weak against heavy slam melees, so if you put something together like this, it's just an example with the Arcatitron and this build, you can use any other hammer, you can use the Sampotes, you get the point, right? Magistar Incarnon, whatever. Give it a heavy slam build, and you're gonna melt through the Acolytes pretty quickly. One thing that you could also always go for would be the Furax Wraith or MK1 Furax, because you can give him, the Amalgam Furax thing that gives more fire rate to secondary weapons, aka more DPS for our Thrax Killer gun. And then last but very much not least would be Gunblades. If we look at, for example, something like the Vastalok right here, then we can make use of Shattering Impact to use that to strip away the Thrax's armor. If you don't have an armor stripping ability, you don't have anything with corrosive to strip away the armor, just wanted to put that out there, just an option, probably very niche, but yeah, there you have it. Okay, we now talked about basically everything regarding the loadout, except the arguably most important thing, and that would be your operator. Because in Void Cascade, you need your operator to deal the massive numbers and dispose of these ghost forms of the Thrax units. Let's start out with the amps. For amps, there are a few combinations that you can vary between that are generally accepted to be the best ones for Void Cascade, but one thing that does not change is the Certus Brace, this one right here. This is something that you're gonna see on every meta amp for Void Cascade because this gives us the most crit chance, crit damage that we can possibly have. That's what we want. For the scaffold that determines the alt fire, there are generally two options that are accepted, which would be the FOD scaffold as well as the Propa scaffold. The FOD one is a very nice alt fire. It's sort of a glaive that bounces between enemies, a bit like the Cedo alt fire, and it's generally a pretty good one. If, however, you prefer the big bada-boom explosion, you can go for the Propa scaffold, which puts down a time-delayed bomb that explodes in a bit of an AoE. I personally prefer the FOD one, but if you have other preferences here, then you could also go with something else. It's not going to mess up the stats of your amp. The, however, most important part would of course be the prism, as that is the primary fire of your amp. And here there are generally, as far as I've seen, two accepted options. The first one, and my personal favorite, is the Raplac prism. This is basically a sniper beam. It's a slow-firing semi-automatic laser, but it gives you the most crit chance, most crit damage, and it comes with a massive 3000 base damage. If you want to deal the most damage possible in one shot, then this is objectively the best solution. Alternatively, I've also heard that many people like the Cantic Prism. This one has a bit less damage, it has a little bit less crit as well, however it fires a 3-round burst, so it's a bit more forgiving if you don't nail that one headshot with the Raplac one, right? This is objectively the most damage in the best case scenario, this one is a bit more forgiving. I prefer the Raplac Prism, which would lead us to this amp right here, if you want to just test out other things, right? Who am I to tell you what to play? One thing though that I've recently learned, and a little bit of a secret tip that you can use for Void Cascade, has to do with your Deviri intrinsics. Let me show you what I mean. If you want to min-max the absolute crap out of your operator, then what you can do is you can go for the rank 9 intrinsic of the combat tree in Deviri. This one gives you plus 25% operator damage, and it not only works in Deviri, it works across all content in the game. It's not going to make or break the entire game mode, but I thought it was interesting to know. But okay, now that we build to the right amp, we of course also need to talk about the right amp Arcanes. And here there's really not all that much variation. On the one hand, and a definite must-have is Eternal Eradicate. This one will give you plus 60% damage when you use an operator ability. Basically, free damage, so we want that. And the second one is Eternal Onslaught. When you fully deplete the energy of your operator, you will get 180% crit chance for 8 seconds. However, you might be wondering, how exactly are we going to trigger these? Well, that's what we're going to get into now, because now we're talking about focus schools. And also here, if you want to play the meta for Void Cascade, if you want to get the most damage possible, you will go for Madarai. This is because the Madarai Focus School has 2 very helpful abilities. The first one is Contamination Wave. This one shoots out an energy wave, a little bit like an Arca plasma projectile, and enemies that get hit by that will receive 50% more vulnerability to our operator damage. That's very nice, because we can cast that at the Thrax when the ghost form is coming out, and then it will just take more damage. Also, it's good to delete these rifts from the Exolizers if they're bunched up in one spot. Just, cast one of these projectiles into it and they're all going to be gone. The second ability, though, is also incredibly nice. Void Strike. This one will consume all your operator's energy and will give you therefore a little bit of additional damage, depending on how much energy you consumed. This extra damage isn't really the reason why we use it. It's of course nice, but the main reason is for your Eternal Onslaught Arcane on your amp. What we just talked about, right? If your energy is completely depleted, you get 180% crit chance. In addition to these active skills, you also get some buffs in the Madarai Focus School for even more damage, like Power Transfer, right? The moment you get out of your Warframe into the operator, you get more amp crit damage and all that stuff. Just saying, overall, Madarai is the way to go if you want to have as much damage as possible against the ghost forms of the Thrax units. However though, just because Madarai is the best, does not mean that any other focus school is bad. Also here, one important mention, ideally, what I unfortunately haven't done yet, you want to unlock both the Yurnairu Waybounds, regardless of which focus school you pick, because of Last Gasp as well as Vengeance. These are going to be used to revive your Warframe if you ever go down without having to burn a revive, right? Last Gasp is going to enable that in the first place. You need to take out 3 enemies with the operator and then you can be back on your feet again. And Vengeance increases your operator damage output during this bleed out phase, making it even easier to take out the enemies. But whoever says Focus School also needs to quickly take a look at the Operator Arcane. So how about we do that? The first Arcane slot right here is relatively up to personal preference. There's a lot of good stuff that you can go for. You can use Magus Elevate to heal your Warframe, but you could also generate energy in an emergency situation with something like Emergence Dissipate. That's also perfectly fine, right? Go for whatever you like. The one that is not so flexible, but basically a must-have in my opinion, is Magus Lockdown. With this one, you create this little tether grenade that stuns enemies in the AoE around you, and that is the thing that will keep you safe from Acolytes and help you take them out faster if you have problems with the Acolytes. And last but not least, let's talk about something that I think no popular Void Cascade guide has ever talked about because it is such a new mechanic, the Tectilist artifact. Let's talk about how we are going to mod that, because it too increases our performance in Void Cascade quite a lot. These right here are the mods that I picked. Hyan Dabor gives my amp more multi-shot, so more damage output, which is nice. Omnivi gives me more amp critical chance and even more crit chance for everything that is from a Xeneric focus school. So in this build right here, 2, and that means 20% more, means 80% amp crit chance on top. Estivel Ika increases maximum void sling distance and further increases that with everything from a unique focus school. Basically, this is what you use to traverse the distance between the rooms a bit more, because, slinging around with your operator is generally a very fast way to move, and this one gives you more distance. Vic Anam right here gives our amp more energy, so we have more shots, and it also increases our amp energy regen a bit. This one is not necessarily all too great, so if you don't like it, you could swap it out for something else. Lastly, Ubri Knef right here increases damage to amps, and it gives us bonus damage for every mod from a unique school. And then finally, as the Arcane, there's really only one thing that really works here, and that would be Zit an Osbok, which not only strips enemy overguard if you void sling through them, very good against the Thrax units, but it also gives you a flat 3x crit damage on your amp when that happens. Like, if you void sling through a Thrax unit once, then it's gonna be pretty freaking good, right? This is a very Void Cascade-centric Arcane. And then in the second build right here, it's basically the same thing, but I swapped one mod for Hawk Cal, which makes it that after you've been in Void mode, your next amp attack deals 3 times bonus damage. And yeah, the Tectilist artifact itself, like the bow or whatever, I personally never use that because it's like not really reliable. If you want to use it, go use it, but I care more about the mods for the operator amp, if I might say that. Alright, now that we know the full operator setup, there is one last thing that I want to get back to before we end the video. And that is how you incorporate all these operator arcane skills and buffs to take out Thrax units as quickly as possible. And in Big 2026, there are actually 2 viable methods. Both of them use the Madurai focus school, however they differ quite a bit. Tactic number 1 would be the legacy one. When the Thrax unit pops out of the Exilizer, you go into your Warframe and take out the physical form, status priming, armor stripping, and just in general deleting that as quickly as possible. Then, when the Ghost comes out, you transition back into Operator and hit the enemy with your second ability to make them more vulnerable to void damage, followed by your first, which consumes all the remaining energy and therefore triggers Eternal Onslaught, giving you that fat crit bonus. Alternatively, you could also skip the first ability and just spam cast your second until the energy is empty, which will then also trigger Eternal Onslaught. You then headshot the Thrax and get a big damage number. Method number 2 though is brand new in 2026. This one got only enabled through the introduction of Tectilist artifacts in the December update. What we do here is make use of Zit an Osbok, the arcane on our Tectilist artifact. Remember, when you void sling through an enemy, it takes away some of their overguard, and it gives you the fat 3 times crit damage bonus. That's not all though, we're gonna combine that with the Hawk Cal mod that gives you a 3 times total damage multiplier on your next amp shot after you've activated Void mode. Might sound complicated, but here is how that would look in practice. When the Thrax pops out of the Exilizer, we're actually not gonna go back into our Warframe right away. Instead, we're going to go into Void mode with our operator and spam a couple of Void Slings at the physical form of the Thrax. This will melt away their overguard with the Arcane, give us the 3x crit damage multiplier, also from the Arcane, and because we're doing it in Void mode, it's not only quicker, but it will also activate the Hawk Cal that will give us the 3x damage multiplier on our next shot. Only after that, we're going to transition back into Warframe, and we'll see that the overguard is basically already gone. We can then very quickly shoot down the physical form and transition back into Operator. At this point, with all the buffs stacked up, we technically don't even need any further Operator abilities, but if you want to make sure, then you can of course also cast your first and second at the Ghost form. And yeah, as you see, millions of damage, definitely level cap worthy. The thing with this second method is that due to the fact that we're taking out the overguard of the Thrax unit with the operator, we're technically not forced to have this dedicated secondary weapon build that is focused on purely melting away overguard. This would allow us to either switch up our pistol build, or forgo that pistol-centric gameplay altogether and instead use our primary weapon against the physical form. I'm not saying one method is better than the other, but it's definitely an option that you should try out in 2026. And now check out this guide here for even more very profitable farms in Warframe. Big thank you to Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nos Linux Gaming, Underkane02, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Hantagas, Patricedu, Boomia1, Zaif, Amindai, Azengent Quax, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthwield, Everin 8802, Gabriel Tevez, Yaku Ivan Gonzalez, G.E. Schnoz, Muffdisk, Grunju, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.